Thank you, and thank you to all of our education advisors from governors across the country, our sponsors, many others. I hope you enjoyed the school visit this morning. Our first speaker, Dr. Richard Reeves, has drawn a lot of attention to the importance of the growing struggle of boys and men in education, workforce readiness, social engagement. I think the culture, the world, there's a lot of questions about that. And we've also, of course, spoken with experts who've worked on the achievement gaps among girls and young women, particularly in STEM fields at our New York gathering. We talked about that as well. And in fact, some of Dr. Reeves' work is how we can make some of the traditionally female professions more open to boys and men, just as we've also, from the other end, talked about some of the traditionally male professions and how we need to break down barriers for women. Those can often be cultural barriers, but they can also be pedagogical barriers as well about how we approach and deal with instruction in different areas. In his book of Boys and Men, Richard really lays out the data, policy relevant insights on how to respond. And we really want to explore today how our education system works for all learners. I think starting with really taking a step back, Richard, and say, should we be talking about boys? We have these difficult conversations. Should we be talking about people of different races, of boys, of girls, or are we really just talking about everybody? Because everybody's on some continuum, and obviously, again, data will show that boys might have slightly different brain development or mature a little bit later, but those are all averages. So should we even be talking about gender? Because, of course, some 11-year-old boys will be ahead of brain development than some 12-year-old girls. I mean, is what's relevant the gender, or is it just the underlying characteristics? And are we helping ourselves by talking about gender, or are we hurting ourselves by talking about gender?
Wow, nice softball to start with, Governor. Thank you. Well, thanks. A pleasure and privilege to be here. Thank you for that. I should say that although I run the American Institute for Boys and Men, you may detect those who haven't spoken to me already. I'm from the UK originally, but I'm a proud US citizen now. Became a citizen in 2016. So thank you for having me. I love this country, and I love its promise of upward mobility. It's the thing that's really motivated most of my work. And I suppose part of what I'm pitching here is a kind of let's get boys and men ready, and women and girls. So the question of whether we should be talking about gender at all, I think it depends really on what the data is telling us, right? You could make similar arguments around the gender pay gap, right? So there are lots of women now who earn more than lots of men. That's an average gap, right? But I still think that there's enough evidence for a difference in pay by gender to mean we should look at it as a partly gendered issue rather than just saying, oh, we don't need to look at the gender anymore, or the gender of people in senior leadership. We're still only 10% of CEOs of Fortune 500 companies are women. Now, that's a lot more than it was just 20 years ago, but it's still only 10%. And so I think when the data suggests that there's a sufficient gap by gender, even at the average, that should draw the attention of policymakers and of parents and of everybody else who's in the field. So to some extent, I think it should be partly an empirical question. The reason that we've ended up doing this work is because there are some pretty big gaps. And so in education, for example, and many of you will know this, so I can do the short version, there's now a bigger gap in higher education in terms of college achievement today, a bigger gender gap than there was in the early 70s. But it's the other way around. And so there was about a 13 percentage point gap, gender gap in college, four-year college degree acquisition in 71, 72, and it's about 16-point gap now the other way around. Now, it might be that it's for different reasons and it has different consequences, and I'm happy to have that conversation, but like a gap is a gap. So if you see a gap, then I think we should investigate that gap and see whether or not there's something structural about it. In K-12, we see pretty big gaps across the board now. And so if you look at the work of AIBM, you'll see work we've done on GPA, et cetera. And you'll see that in terms of GPA, there's just a very big gender gap. 2/3 of those in the top 10% of the GPA distribution are girls, and 2/3 of those in the bottom 10% are boys, with a pretty linear relationship in between. And so there's a very big GPA gap. There's also big gender gaps in things like exclusion, diagnosis for developmental disability, and so on and so on. And so I think there's enough in education to warrant some attention and to just say there is a specific issue facing boys. It is particularly true for black boys and young men. And it is particularly true for boys and men from more working class and lower income backgrounds. And so there is an important intersection there. But I think to that extent, the data speaks for itself. I think the challenge is the framing, which is kind of what you've provocatively put on the table, Governor, which is, I think it's challenging us to think two thoughts at once. Is to say there's still a lot to do for women and girls in many areas, some of which you mentioned, and there's growing evidence we need to do more for boys and men over here. If we continue to see it as an or rather than an and, I think that leads us to a difficult situation where policymakers and maybe culture more broadly is just continuing to frame gender as a zero-sum game. And that somehow to care about the problems of boys and men is to betray your support for the issues of women and girls. And maybe the other way around too, which is that to become somebody who's really focused on the problems of boys and men, it very often becomes a preserve of people who want to roll back the clock on women and girls. And so that's a very unsatisfactory situation, and I think it's important that policymakers step forward. And I'll close, and I'm happy to get into issues around mental health and wages and anything anyone else is interested in, but I know this is primarily an education audience. Governor Wes Moore used his State of the State to issue some work around boys and men. Governor Gretchen Whitmer did the same thing, but Governor Moore was very well received when he actually got past this zero sum. And he said, given the data, and then he showed some data around suicide rates being 4 times higher and rising for young men, the education data I've just referred to, and he said, in Maryland, just as a father, I want my son and daughter to flourish equally. As governor of Maryland, I don't see a focus on boys and men as a retreat from our commitment to equity, but as an expression of it. And I think in doing so, he absolutely nailed the framing correctly.
I would add, we see also indicators that something is happening on gender, but this has been historically the norm, but it still is. The vast majority of incarcerated individuals are male. Mm-hmm. In Colorado, it's around 86%. I don't know what it is in your states, but that's clearly pretty far from the roughly 50-50 distribution of people. Yeah, as a feminist and progressive, it's hard to talk about because I don't particularly like talking about gender. We just like to pretend it doesn't exist and people can do whatever they want. My daughter wants to be a professional baseball player, and I've always wanted there to be, a woman in the major leagues. The Rockies could use anybody who can play at this point. Let me ask you, how much of this is kind of, from your data and research, is kind of an in the building education, K-12 stuff, versus this broader cultural milieu or what's happening or people wondering what it means or the jobs. So how much is kind of this policy and pedagogy in the building versus just extraneous stuff that has nothing to do with kind of what we do in K-12?
Yeah, well, the honest answer is I don't know. And I don't really know how I would know. And so it's obviously both. I think two things are happening. One is that there is a genuine question now that a lot of young men in particular feel like they're asking themselves, which is like, what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to be? And they very often feel pinballed in the current debate about masculinity and the roles of men and women and gender and Me Too and et cetera, which we can talk about. So I think there's a real search among many boys and men for an answer to the question of how should I be in the world? Because I think some of the old scripts have gone for good reason, but they haven't necessarily been replaced. And I think that's left many boys and young men in search of an answer. And very often, of course, today they will look online now for that. So there's a cultural dimension. But I don't want to miss the fact that like K-12 education is an incredibly important structure through which we communicate a lot of those cultural messages. So I think it happens to matter, for example, that the share of teachers that are male has dropped from 33% to 23%. In public K-12 and continues to fall, which is way lower than the share of women we now have in most of the STEM professions that you mentioned. Now, have we gone far enough to increase the share of women in STEM? No. But should we be just ignoring the fact that we have fewer and fewer men in front of our classrooms as a share every year, especially if we claim, as many do, to be interested in male role models? I think them pulling away from CTE training has been bad, period, but particularly bad for boys and men, given the evidence that boys seem to do better in those forms of learning. And so I think there are various ways in which the education system is definitely not as boy-friendly as it should be. So given that that's what we probably can do something about, we could start there and simultaneously do some of the work on the cultural side too.
So some of that is, again, getting our arms around how to break down the barriers for traditionally female professions to open the doors to men. Teaching, nursing would come to mind.
Yeah.
I think there's been more of a deliberate effort, in some cases successful, in some cases limited success, to break down the doors on traditionally male occupations for women. Very successful in fields like law and medicine, now majority women. Not so much in STEM. Obviously, great progress, but still,
Well, it's more in science, much more so.
it's getting
Engineering
there. It's
better,
certainly
tech
going
not.
the right
Yeah.
way. And I think what you're saying is we should be spending time on both. We shouldn't just now. Here's the kind of challenge from an economic perspective. We've been focused, if you will, or policymakers have, or many have, been saying, oh, the high compensation professions were the ones that were men, and therefore we have to get women in. We haven't been saying as much, oh, those lower compensation professions like teachers, they don't make very much. We should open the doors to men. But I think we have to, it's not all about economics and earning. You can certainly support yourself as a teacher, you can support yourself as a nurse. And it's about how can people with that aptitude and desire not face the cultural barrier.
Right.
And I think also the instructional or pedagogical barrier to get into those fields. Is that kind of what you want to draw our attention to?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a bit of both. I mean, first of all, as some of you know here, actually, there have been some real moves to increase teacher pay in a number of states. I think there's a lag in people's perception of it. My son just started teaching 5th grade in Baltimore City. And
I don't mean, we have great respect, but I mean, it's not likely to pay as much as lawyer or doctor, for instance.
Controlling for the level of education you've got, that's absolutely right. We've actually published some work on what we call HEAL professions, particularly in health and education, as opposed to STEM. And you're right that, of course, on average, the STEM ones do pay better. But many of the ones you just mentioned, like nursing, for example, actually nurses make pretty good money. Teachers less so. The mental health professions in particular, social workers, clinical psychologists, counselors, I'm very worried about that. And there we're seeing a cratering share of men. We're down to 20% male share in those professions. And I do think that pay is a big factor. So sure, we should work on that. But it also turns out there are pipeline issues here. Like if men are more likely to enter teaching as a second career, or after they finish their undergraduate profession, which our work shows they are, then a big question is, how are we making that transition into teaching hard or easy? How are we thinking about that? Because that would be one way to increase the share of men. So there may not be that many 17-year-old young men now choosing to be a teacher. I want there to be more. But it turns out there's quite a few 27-year-old men. So how do we get them in?
I'd like to ask where you've seen this done well. It doesn't matter where in the world. Are there places that defy these trends, other countries? And obviously we're not talking about countries that might have a culture where they don't allow the women to access many jobs, but advanced cultures, but also in in the United States. What has worked in this area? What has said, okay, well, they have achieved parity, or the boys and girls are achieving at the same level, they're accessing professions at the same level. What have you seen along those lines, and what can we learn from that?
Yeah, so it depends on the question. I mean, the U.S., the way that the US works means that the economic outcomes, we've seen this huge rise, as everyone here knows, in wage inequality, which means that non-college educated men have seen stagnant wages for half a century. That's less true in other countries. Also, I see the health effects of poor economic outcomes being much worse in the US and other countries. So I've mentioned suicide already. The US is unusual in having rising suicide rates, and I'm particularly troubled, as I briefly mentioned earlier, in the really sharp rise in suicide rates among young men in the US. It's already, as I said, 4 times higher. It's 40,000 men a year now. But the fact that it's men under 30 really driving that is really of concern. But it doesn't appear to be as true in other countries. So I think partly because the US doesn't have such good safety nets, if you like, to use a very broad term, I think it means the economic consequences and downstream health and family consequences are a bit worse in the US. The education trends are pretty similar everywhere. And in fact, in Scandinavia, the higher education gaps are bigger than they are in the US. And so the education thing is something that everyone is really struggling with now. And because it is pretty international, that suggests that it's not something weird about the US K-12 system or the British system or the German system. It's something more structural than that, which is maybe something we can kind of get into. No one's really succeeded, with one exception, in having parity of male and female teachers, and that exception is Singapore. Where it's about 50-50 male-female teachers. The teaching profession in Singapore is a wholly different animal, as we were discussing last night. And so I think there may be some lessons to learn there from it's a well-paid, highly structured, upwardly mobile profession in Singapore, and as a result, they have half men.
And I mean, and there's, there's certainly some data, and some of it exists with regards to race, but I'm sure it'll apply to gender too. I mean, when students see a teacher like them, or have teachers that have the same cultural context, it could be cultural background, it could be gender, they're more likely to be able to identify with that as a potential profession for themselves, and aspire to that.
That's part of the hope. There's better data on race around that right now. The evidence on gender is pretty mixed, but I think the line from the women's movement, which I really like, is you can't be it if you can't see it. And so there is a bit of a tipping point here, which you just get to a point where if more and more boys and girls grow up seeing female teachers, and now not just in elementary and middle, but increasingly in high school as well, that just sends a message, right? I think it's just, we can't avoid the fact that people look at their eyes, or they use their eyes, not their ears, and they see female teachers. So teaching, weirdly, these professions are becoming more female. Right, and so it's not just that they are female, it's that they're becoming more female. The lines are going down in terms of male share. At least with those other areas in STEM, the lines are mostly going up. So we're making progress. And so it's weird that we're going backwards in terms of the gender separation in some parts of the labour market, including K-12 teaching.
And I think we're at a, an odd cultural moment as well. I think on the left, they definitely want to see race, but they don't want to see gender. On the right, they don't want to see race, but they do want to see gender, not always in constructive ways on the left and the right. I mean, the left will see race in an unconstructive way. The right will see gender in an unconstructive way. How do we get out? That's the dominant cultural milieu in politics. How do we kind of get out of that to make progress?
It's very interesting. Like, just anecdotally, I was talking to someone who runs a program recently which is focused on educational outcomes for black boys. And he was saying that under the previous administration, under the Biden administration, they would basically say, we work on race, we work on race equity, we're really focused on black outcomes. Oh, and by the way, we do boys. And then the new administration, what they're saying is we really do stuff for boys, we're really kind of focused on boys and kind of male outcomes and boys, and by the way, they're mostly black. And so it's just interesting how the optics of these things shift. But at a state level, especially given where we're speaking, and again, I'm going to point to Governor Whitmer, Governor Moore, who I really think are really leading on this, which is go to the data, look at where the issues are, see where you've still got issues for women and girls, see where you've got them for boys and men, intersect by race, because quite often this might turn out to be a specific issue for, say, black boys and men, or Hispanic women and girls, or whatever. That's why data is so important to this. So try and turn it as much into an empirical question. One of the sound bites at the Institute, and sitting on my left is Alana Williams, who's managing director of the Institute, and I'm going to encourage her also to answer any of the questions that you all have. But one of our internal mottos around this is keep it boring. And as my son said, well, you're the man for that job, Dad. But the serious thought behind that is that I just think too much of the discussion about gender does get culture war-y very quickly. And actually, it should just be, let's look at the data, let's look at the evidence, let's see what's working. So Governor Whitmer, for example, her executive order specifically asks the people looking at Michigan Reconnect and saying, why is it that we're getting twice as many women as men into our Reconnect program, back into education? Go find out for me what's happening there, and then come up with some ways to get more men into Michigan Reconnect. I think that's a great example of being led by the data to good policy, rather than going on a podcast and talking about the need for a different kind of masculinity or whatever.
And how can policymakers balance this need to better support all learners, and if boys are underperforming, support boys and men, while still not conflicting with gender equality? Again, it feels when we get to say we're supporting one gender or the other, how do we say we're in fact supporting both?
Yeah, well, again, I think the way I answer that is to be empirical about it, is to say, look, I don't think we should look at gender just period. I think we should use gender as one of the lenses through which we look at outcomes, very often intersected with race and sometimes with class as well, and then see. And there may well come a point, for example, I'll go back to the example I used at the beginning. Is there going to come a day where we don't think we need to measure the gender pay gap anymore? Maybe. But I still find gender a very useful way to look at labour force participation, wages, representation in senior jobs, etc. And the data is continuing to suggest that there's a there. And so you look at it, but very often in our work we'll say, oh, that would be interesting. Let's see if there's a gender dimension to that particular problem. And there isn't. But sometimes there is. And when there is, you say, oh, that's interesting. Why is that playing out differently for, say, women and girls compared to boys and men? So you mentioned men being much more likely to be incarcerated. That's true, of course, because men commit most of the crimes. So that's as maybe a successful gender gap in some ways rather than unsuccessful one, and not necessarily a problem. The problem is the underlying crime, but it turns out that a lot of the educational, people here might know more about this than me, the programs in prisons, because they were based on male learning styles, weren't working as well for the women who were there. And so there was a development of more gender appropriate learning for female prisoners. I find that a really great example of just saying, look, these things aren't working as well for the female prisoners because we've assumed a sort of male default. At the risk of being a bit provocative, I think sometimes the opposite might be happening a bit in mainstream K-12 now, where there's a bit of a default assumption that the ideal student is a girl, and that boys end up being treated a bit like malfunctioning girls. And so we just have to be a bit careful that there isn't an implied default in learning style, behavioral style, attention, etc., which is implied female, which would then inadvertently disadvantage men in just the same way that the prison programs inadvertently disadvantaged the female prisoners.
So we talked about, inside the building, K-12, we talked about the culture milieu. The third piece, and you're not afraid of it, is biology, and you discussed that as well. There's presumably some differences between the two genders. Anybody that discusses that obviously in the race context is sort of cast out and blacklisted, but I think it's slightly more acceptable in the gender context. But what are the insights from, if there are any, biological differences between men and women?
Well, I mean, there are the ones that are most relevant to education, and then there are others more generally. But I think the important thing, it is a difficult area to discuss. And I think it should only be discussed where we think it matters. Right, I think that there could be some differences on the average that just don't matter, right? And we're like, fine. And there are others where the differences are at the average, but the distributions overlap so tightly that it's as if it doesn't matter, right? But there are others where it might not be true. And so one of the ones I'm very interested in is the difference in the developmental trajectories of boys and girls. And again, at the average, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment, but partly because girls hit puberty earlier than boys, they just develop into adolescence a bit more quickly, and that gives
also significantly earlier than they used to several decades ago.
Yeah, the menarche is coming earlier, which is a whole different and in some way troubling trend. But one thing that does is it just means that the average 15-year-old girl has got higher non-cognitive skills than the average 15-year-old boy. Not necessarily higher cognitive skills. And it's interesting, I mentioned those GPA gaps earlier, but there isn't really a gender gap on the SAT. So a huge GPA gap, not really a big SAT gap. And so I think what that suggests to me, at least, is that this isn't really a difference in kind of cognitive ability. It's not that girls are smarter than boys, or vice versa, but the difference in GPA suggests that they are ahead in terms of organizational skill, planfulness, deferring gratification, all of that stuff. And I'm reasonably convinced by the evidence that's partly because of the different developmental trajectories for boys and girls. And then the pushback is, well, that's on average, right? There are plenty of girls who are developing slower than boys and boys who are ahead. And that's true. But on most of the measures I can see, that's also true between one grade and the next grade. So there's a huge overlap between third graders and fourth graders as well, and yet we put some into third grade and some into fourth grade. And so I think it does affect education policy to think about developmental trajectories, and the fact that boys mature later than girls is something that policymakers should take into account.
Well, let's open it up for this vibrant discussion on this important topic. What's on all of your minds? Yes, Maria from North Dakota.
Yes, thank you. So as a former teacher, and I have 2 boys and 1 girl as a parent, I can see from my classroom experiences, but also from parenting, that girls, not all, but lots of times girls are very compliant in the classroom, and boys seem to be very active. What can school systems do? And then I'm going to preface this a little bit. I think what's happened over time is so much of the focus is on academics and less on active play, and probably getting some of the energy out. Talk about what can policymakers do to consider just that difference a little bit, and recognizing that compliance isn't always engagement from our kids, whether it's boys or girls.
Right.
And then how does active play really play into successful outcomes?
Yeah, so I think the compliance does not equal engagement is a really great line. Because I do think that's one of the ways that this developmental difference kind of plays out, rather, or compliance is exactly the right word. And I don't know if this was your experience, but a lot of teachers will say that even when if the girls are disengaged, they still turn in their assignments. Once the boys disengaged, you've lost them completely. And so, so what that means, the good news there is it means that if we made schools more engaging, it would be good for everybody, but it would be especially good for boys in terms of those measured outcomes. And there's all kinds of reasons why we might see that compliance difference, but I think it's also one of the reasons why we see this evidence that the tougher the learning environment, both at the school level and the neighborhood, the bigger the gender gaps. And you see that in a whole range of areas, by the way. We just published a summary of a paper showing that an eviction in childhood affects the educational outcomes for boys, but not really for girls. And so there's just a big difference. Boys just seem a little bit easier to derail. The harder the environment is, they just seem to struggle, whereas girls seem to be a little bit better at keeping it going. Like, keep on trucking a little bit more. So I think that's interesting and potentially of value for policymakers to know. On the play movement thing, it was interesting. Michael and I were just in one of the classrooms we were just in. Michael was, I hope you don't mind me saying this, he was like, you can just see it here. I can see the boys squirming, right? In some of the classrooms there. The truth is, and maybe Alana will chip in here too, that there isn't good evidence base on this. I mean, intuitively, we sort of know it to be true, that movement issue is true for boys, but the evidence is pretty mixed on, for example, like longer recess, more time. There's a couple of schools that we've looked at, right? Do you want to say a bit more about that, Anna?
Yeah, totally. Well, in general, like recess and free play, like the decline of that is very real, especially since the No Child Left Behind reallocation of kind of this playtime to school time, and so we do see those trends really strongly, and it's really where people like default to, like, oh, boys are so active and they need to move around, and like there's evidence for that piece, but then how you actually design a system and a structure within a school to best facilitate outcomes for boys as well as girls, while still maintaining some of those core competency developments on the more cognitive side, is like a pretty underexplored space. Like, we've got a 50-page document going through. We're like, yeah, on net, recess, probably good. Like, PE in middle school, where like people are gonna maybe like not show up so much, maybe it's gonna replace math, like a little bit more unclear. And so we're really hoping to do some more work on this. So subscribe to our newsletter.
It's a really good example of the sort of work that we're finding ourselves being able to do, because there just isn't much work on it empirically, and I think that's partly because it does seem to be likely to be an issue that's affecting boys more, and up until fairly recently, the flow of funding into researching why boys and men are doing worse hasn't been as great as any other direction.
Your thoughts on and the data on single-sex learning environments for boys, for girls? We have them; they exist. They're not the common. And then there's obviously a hybrid there. It doesn't have to be a fully single-sex learning environment. There's like girls-only science classes. There could be boys-only, that sort of thing.
It's another example of an area that is just massively under-researched, and that we are trying to engage in more work on. I'll say something and then Alana can add. But I looked at this hard when I was writing the book. A lot of people come along and say, oh, single-sex schools. The truth is that the evidence for better academic outcomes for either girls or boys from single-sex schools is just not very strong. Partly the selection effects are huge, of course, right? The sorts of parents who choose to send their kids to those schools are not randomly selected. But there is also a massive research opportunity here, because since No Child Left Behind, thanks to the amendment put down by Senator Hillary Clinton, we've got a couple of hundred public single-sex schools now. And we haven't really found anybody that's kind of used that opportunity to do kind of research, because the research on this is pretty old. And if anything, it suggests it might be better for girls to be in single-sex schools to get them away from all those boys, and because boys dominated classrooms, etc. But I just don't think that's true in co-ed schools anymore. It may also be that those schools provide some of those softer skills, non-cognitive skills that you were talking about last night, in an environment that's easier to develop that. But the truth is, we don't know much yet. Is that fair, summary, Alana?
Yeah, I would say that's fair. I think there is some evidence that, like, the middle ground of the single-sex classroom might kind
Right.
of be the worst of both worlds in some ways,
Yeah.
in that all students really benefit from a higher share of girls in their classroom
Right.
immediately, in their immediate vicinity. There's a lot of hypotheses as to why, but then when you take it to the school-wide level, there's an opportunity to change more things about the structure of the school, the classroom, the culture, the types of teachers who are there, and so.
There's a lot more male teachers in male schools, the extracurriculars will be different, et cetera.
Well, I believe that governors also benefit greatly by the vicinity of women. So 2/3 of my cabinet are women. So, yes, go ahead.
So obviously, we're big fans of relevancy inside of education, making sure kids are learning and able to grow on things that they care about, things that they feel connected to. But I'm wondering if there is and perhaps this is overly simplistic, but is there a way of just straight up teaching better study habits, better note-taking, better, like I've seen in my own house, both of my daughters know how to study. My son, very bright, but doesn't necessarily know how to study, doesn't know how to make sure. I'm like, are your next set of exams on your phone so you know when they're coming, or your assignments? And it's just a different, so how do we teach some of those executive functioning skills that become important for kids? Or there's this assumption that it's intuitive.
Yeah.
And we've got to move beyond that.
Yeah, well, I've raised 3 boys, now all in their 20s, so if I knew the answer to that question, I would share it with you. But I do think it's true that boys need more scaffolding around those organizational skills, but not in a way that you're trying to scaffold them through, but not undermine the development of those skills, and that's a difficult challenge. I think one of the reasons, by the way, that we see smaller gender gaps in more affluent families, more affluent schools, is because the parents are able to step in and fill some of those kind of executive functioning gaps on behalf of their boys, and that they do. It was interesting because there was some evidence that parents, I was at Brookings, some evidence that parents were investing more time in supporting their boys' education, particularly in the higher socioeconomic levels, than in their girls. And I remember a colleague coming to me and saying, you see, the patriarchy is alive and well. Parents are still focused more on their boys. And I said, I don't think that's patriarchy. I think that's the parents realizing the boys need more help, and therefore giving them more help, and therefore you don't see such bigger gender gaps. So I don't have a great answer to the question, other than it turns out that's got scaffolding, tutoring, structured learning, etc., is going to be differentially paying off for boys compared to girls. Turning in homework is a 7-step process that is just a bit harder for boys than for girls, hence the GPA gap, I think.
Gary?
Thanks you both for being here and talking through this important topic with us. Gary Boardman with City Fund. You talked earlier about the need to make schooling more engaging for boys. I wonder if you could unpack that a little bit. Like, have you all done any research into what that could look like, very sort of programmatically in core content areas?
Short answer is not yet. We're actually talking to the College Board about some of these issues. It's interesting that although they're very small at this stage, even some of the new AP offerings, I think are part of an effort to make school a bit more engaging for boys. So the AP cybersecurity is 75% male. Is that what we got? I think we got the data from you. Yeah. And I'll speak for myself here. I'm encouraging the College Board to see that as a feature rather than a bug. If that turns out to be one of the very few AP classes that attracts more boys than girls, then maybe, given all the gender gaps the other way, that's not a bad thing. I think male teachers are part of it. I think extracurriculars are part of it. I think some of what Alana talked about around play and structured extracurricular is part of it. We do see a decline in the share of, probably a decline in the share of boys doing sport, and girls much more like to do all the other extracurriculars. And so I think there's something about investing in the services around schools to make the school environment as a whole one that's more boy-friendly and maybe help to keep them in the classroom. But the truth is, it's a big part of our research agenda going forward. I don't have a great answer yet.
Yeah, and pretty high on that research agenda is understanding also why boys are so successful in career and technical education and technical high schools, and if some of those lessons can be
That's exactly right.
The implications from some of that is like, we'll scale those, right? And
Yeah, more
another
technical high schools, yeah.
implication is, well, what can we actually understand if this is the hands-on learning nature of this, if this is the project-based nature of this, if this is the
More applied.
more applied nature of it, that we can then take some of those lessons maybe into more conventional classrooms.
Yeah, I wondered if then you can drill that, you can then sort of backwards map that into middle schools and elementary schools as well, and take some of those sort of concepts and apply them earlier and earlier at the grade levels as well.
A lot of this is at a theory stage at this point, but as right around the CTE stuff's fascinating. So Michael Reichart, some of you will know his work, he argues quite strongly that boys are more relational learners. And then there's this other work too about the work being more applied. And so to put it horribly simplistically, again, I'll stop saying on the average and assume that this group just trusts me on that boys need to know who and why before they care about what. So I need to who are you as the teacher? Do I care about you? Do I have a relationship with you? Why am I learning this abstract, apparently pointless stuff? And then maybe I'll do it. And that's back to the question about compliance, is that kind of it just turns out that girls might be just better at getting it done, even when it seems pointless and boring. So what the good news there is that if we made less of it pointless and boring, the boys would do better, but it'd be better for the girls too. It would disproportionately affect the boys. So I think making it less pointless and less boring, it doesn't sound like an easy thing to do, but turns out for boys, it's especially important.
So the premise of this initiative is really focused on what are sort of the outcomes measures or indicators that we should be paying attention to improve success for students. And so I'm just curious, is there any sort of gender lens that we should be thinking about when thinking about different indicators? And in particular, are there early warning signs or early indicators that we should be paying attention to before we're just looking at test scores?
I think my main response would be to just ensure that we're looking at the indicators through a gender lens, right? And seeing if there are differences by gender in the outcomes by those indicators, rather than necessarily having kind of specific indicators. Because it's just not quite striking how often we just find ourselves saying to people, have you broken those by gender? And sometimes by gender and race. And just the simple fact of seeing whether or not there are differences in whatever measures you do end up looking at. I don't know if this is a good or a bad thing, but something like immediate transition from high school to post-secondary, there's a very big gender gap there. I was quite startled, actually, by the gender gap that we found when we looked at that. It hadn't gone up since the 60s, was that right, Alana?
Yeah.
I think it's since 64. Yeah. Now, you could say, oh, it's great, they're taking a gap year for their frontal cortex to develop a bit more. But I think it might be more of a derailing thing. And so I'll make a general point which might be helpful as we think about these indicators. It seems as if these transition points from middle to high, from high to post-secondary labor market, from home to alone, that those, I think of them as sort of opportunities or stepping stones in a way. That very often does seem to be where gender really kind of kicks in. It just feels like the kind of the linear pattern that a lot of girls seem to have. They just seem to be better at sort of staying on track. And you really see that in higher education as well. There's a lot of stopping out among men that can then lead to a dropout. But what seems to happen is that they'll go down a particular path, say, to do course X, and then if that doesn't work out, they stop out and then maybe drop out. Whereas the women students are much more like to say, okay, I'll switch to biochemistry, right, and keep going. And so there's a non-linearity to the male trajectories that I think is important to bear in mind. It's something not just about whether, but also when. It seems like you can derail boys and young men a little bit more. And that's one of the reasons I was so worried about COVID. I mean, when COVID hit and the male college enrollment rate dropped 7 times more than the female one, that was one of the things that set my alarm bells ringing. Because I'm like, okay, that's a big derailing of male educational trajectories.
Yeah.
I wonder if you've done any work. It seems like if you talk to the young people themselves, to them, I think it seems like gender is less important part of their identity than it might have been a generation ago. I mean, certainly some of them don't even have a gender they identify with. But I don't think they divide into boys and girls as much as they used to. It was a bigger part of, I think, the identity of kids growing up in the previous generation. Have you talked to kind of young people in this, and do they see gender as relevant, or do they think it is something that's kind of a label that's not relevant to their lives?
Interesting. Did you want to add something on the last point, Alana? Okay. So, yeah, it depends. I mean, in some ways, of course, gender is much more salient now. even as people kind of switching identity. There's certainly much more discussion of gender identity than there was. So I'm not sure if it's less important. It might be different. In some ways, it's too important, if I can put it that way. It's got too much salience, like in a way. And it may well be, but I could be wrong about that. And it may well be that we'll get to a point where these categories just don't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense anymore, even to be breaking our data this way. But I think we're a very long way from that point, honestly. And I think part of the challenge here has been that in order to recognize that there are exceptions to the gender binary and that people will transition or identify as non-binary, that we somehow have to obliterate the rule. Like, to honor the exceptions, we have to get rid of the rule, and I think that that's a mistake. And of course, some people the other way will say that we shouldn't have exceptions, right? Everyone has to be forced into this binary, and I think that's been part of the kind of polarizing discussion around gender that we've had, that's left actually kind of a lot of young people almost over-indexing on gender identity in some ways. And to be clear, like, I don't think in our work we're encouraging boys and men to make being a boy or a man a bigger part of their identity. I just want to improve high school graduation rates for boys and lower suicide rates for men and get wages up for young men. I'm a gender-based policymaker, not a political kind of identity person. I think that if anything, that's gone a bit too far.
Yeah, thank you. I think one of the things that's an interesting opportunity in this, because we have to look at race and gender and other things, because they are census markers and have been used for a century or more, flow over into the IPED system in higher education, which I know more about than, but I used to be involved in K-12 policy at the state level. And I think, though, there's a danger, and I think, is I'm not so sure that the solutions will be identified by, the gender, understanding the gender differences, race differences are real. We need to talk about those. But as you're doing the work, it's one of the clear things that when you talk about this, it's clear that the work that's being done to solve this is revealing some, I would say, other typologies in terms of whether it's a future mindset, an ability to navigate complex social environments or different cognitive learning styles or something like that, that and there are probably, the males who are, disappearing from going on to higher education probably represent certain typologies, that there are actually women who have the same, and it's the same thing with race, is that the underlying issues, the underlying challenges that affect them can be affected by identity, but actually there's something else going on, right? Because obviously one of the things we know is that those who actually graduate from college, particularly from, they say, the top 100 most competitive universities in the country, men are by far the highest earners. Because they go into the majors, they dominate the majors of the highest earning, right? So there's this typology of men who are extraordinarily successful, through higher education. And so starting to understand these behavioral and learning style and other types of typologies, I think, enriches the conversation rather than just race and gender. And I think, but starting with the focus of your work helps foster a sort of a research and evaluation mindset to start to understand those things. So it's important, but I think we've got to figure out how to get to a conversation about those other typologies.
Sure. And I would just say class in particular tends to be something that cuts across this in a very big way. And I mentioned the gender gaps being smaller at the top of the distribution, for sure. I'm not sure it's true that men still dominate the higher earning majors in elite universities anymore. Certainly areas like business studies and so on are pretty close. I think that's now equal. I think what happens is that once we go into the labor market, there are very different trajectories, especially around family responsibilities. And so what we see is that the gender gap pay gap is being very largely driven by these labor market effects. And that's an opportunity for me to say that's why we're very proud that we've actually been advocating strongly for paid leave that's dedicated to fathers. I think unless we're going to change some of the structures of family life, and that's a huge role for states. In fact, there's research out. Is it out yet? The research from Paid Leave for All? I think it's come out today. Tomorrow. Okay, so this is coming out tomorrow, showing a big uptake in paid leave in the states that increase paid leave among fathers. And I think in your state, Governor, it's 50-50.
It's been pretty close. Yeah. We have we're about 2 years into 12 weeks paid leave. It's pretty
So
close.
I think that's a good example of two thoughts at once, right? We need to We need the labor market to work better for parents, and that will, by definition, right now help women more. And we need the education system to work better for boys. And I don't feel the need to choose between those two priorities. I think we can do both.
It seems like, we're talking about getting women and girls into high-paying professions, STEM, et cetera. For the professions that are traditionally female, I think it's more of a stigma we're dealing with. We have to destigmatize male homemakers, male teachers, male nurses. There's not a universal stigma, but it's not. It's a bit of probably a pure stigma with, and it's not yet commonplace.
And some things are getting worse. I mean, the identity economics work, I think, really does show that if people go against their perceived gender identity into an occupation, that's hard. And we've done huge work, I think, to reduce the stigma against women going into more male-dominated professions. I'm not saying we've completely succeeded, but I think the idea of like a female lawyer or a female engineer or a female scientist is just much more normalized now. But in these other areas, it's not just that there's a stigma for men going into those professions. It is that in many cases, the stigma has gotten worse. And so for men going into education in particular, it's a societal stigma. It's not the teaching profession. It's not their colleagues. It's society generally. And the more female those professions get, the harder it is for men to go into them without attracting question marks. In just the same way, it was harder to be the one female engineer than one of, a third of female engineers. It's now pretty hard, especially in early education. It's pretty hard for men. When I asked for advice very personally for my son going into teaching in 5th grade from other male teachers, I said, what's your main advice? And they just said, well, the most important thing is his door has a window in it. And that really struck me. I mean, most of them do now as well, but it's like if you're a male teacher, and make sure the blind is never down, make sure that your classroom can always be observed. You just don't want any risk at all. And now it's just an N of 1, an example, but I think that we have to be honest about the fact that there are some real challenges for men who want to enter those professions, and as they become more and more female, you reach tipping points where it's going to get harder and harder unless we act sooner. So I'm pleased that Governor Moore and Governor Whitmer and others, and I would hope you too, Governor, will actually start to act now to do something to at least arrest the decline in the share of male teachers in our classroom, not least because, as you said at the beginning, they're good role models, and I think especially in a world where you can get role models online, the best answer to a unserious, potentially reactionary online role model, I think, is a flesh and blood man in the classroom, on the playing field. And one area where policymakers can have some influence there is in our workforce. I think representation matters, and I think it matters in our K-12 teaching profession a lot. And I find it a little bit shocking, frankly, that the number just keeps going down and down without any serious policy response.
Final, who else hasn't gotten in that would like to get into the discussion?
Just on that
Yes,
note,
Tim.
that raises questions about the policy response. What kinds of incentives have you seen that actually do accelerate progress?
Well, there haven't been that many incentives to try and get more men into teaching. I mean, there have been efforts particularly to get more black men into teaching, and there are some good local programs that have been moderately successful as far as we can tell from the outside. The only serious public policy that I've seen more internationally that did it was when Finland introduced a 40% quota for male elementary school teachers. They then knocked it down on the basis that it went against their sex discrimination law. I'll just note in passing that they then introduced a 40% requirement of women on boards since then. So I'm a bit confused about that, to be honest. And I'm not arguing for a quota, to be clear, and it would be illegal in the US. But I do think at least setting some targets, which some school districts have done, to just say we'd like to get up to a certain percentage point, or we want to hire 100 black male teachers or whatever is a good example. I'd love to see some scholarships, frankly. I think that if we think that scholarships to support women into STEM is a good idea, and I continue, even in 2025, to think that that is a good idea, to have then why not scholarships for men into K-12? And then I'd also say, referencing the fact that men come in later, teacher residency programs, making it more remunerative and easier to move into teaching as a second career, grow your own programs that focus particularly on men. And then I would just say in terms of the imaging and the public outreach and the teachers that go into schools to kind of encourage people to do it, who do they look like? Do they look like the men? Do you want to add that?
Yeah, I'll just add quickly that there have been a couple legislative efforts out of some states to fund pilot programs for especially more black male teachers. And there's been some investment. So these are places like New Jersey and Massachusetts have done some early work here. And there are a bunch of programs on the ground who are working on things like Grow Your Own or Call Me Mister is a good one. And folks who are realizing like, hey, actually our substitute teacher population is majority men, and we have a teaching shortage, and maybe there's ways that we can get more of these substitutes transition into permanent teaching roles. And so there are people who are doing some experimentation and thinking on the district and programmatic level too.
Yep, fantastic.
Well, thank you. You know, when we talk about preparing all Americans for success, it of course means boys, girls, anything else they might not identify or identify as, every American for success. And of course, success means very different things. And of course, while earning is important and we care deeply about access to those high wage fields, you can absolutely support yourself, and it can be very fulfilling for those who want to be teachers or nurses or any other profession that has been traditionally female, for the boys and men that have an aptitude for that and desire to do that. So preparing all Americans for success, everybody of all genders, very important piece of that.